I begin this story at the moment ambition first disguises itself as destiny. A young scientist stands alone at the center of a vast chamber, surrounded not by applause, but by fear. Voices rise in protest, hands tremble, eyes widen in disbelief. What lies before them is not merely an experiment, but a challenge to the natural order itself. A body, once lifeless, now breathes again, and in that instant, Victor Frankenstein believes he has touched the very core of existence. He does not see himself as reckless. He sees himself as chosen. To him, this is not arrogance, but inevitability. If the secret of life exists, then surely it is meant to be uncovered by someone bold enough to reach for it. What fascinates me is not the act of resurrection itself, but Victor's certainty. He never pauses to ask whether he should proceed, only whether he can. He believes knowledge is neutral, that discovery alone is justification enough, yet the world around him does not share this belief. Instead of reverence, he is met with condemnation. The scientific institutions that once praised his intellect now brand him a heretic. They accuse him of violating boundaries that humanity was never meant to cross, insisting that life and death are not puzzles to be solved, but mysteries to be respected. Victor listens, but he does not accept their judgment. In his mind, their fear is proof of their weakness, and their rejection only sharpens his resolve. Ironically, even as society denounces him, others quietly reach out. War ravages nations, and death has become both familiar and profitable. Powerful figures recognize the value of Victor's work, not as a philosophical breakthrough, but as a practical tool. They do not care whether his creation is moral, only whether it is useful. And so Victor finds himself funded, protected, and isolated, encouraged to continue down a path he has already chosen. This is where obsession takes its true form. No longer driven solely by curiosity, Victor begins to equate his worth with his ability to overcome nature itself. Each success convinces him that retreat would be a betrayal of his own potential. What the film makes painfully clear to me is that this obsession does not emerge in isolation. It is rooted in Victor's past, in a lifelong hunger for control and recognition. From the very beginning, his pursuit of science is inseparable from his desire to prove himself superior to the forces that once made him feel powerless. Death, in particular, becomes his ultimate adversary. To defeat it would mean more than a scientific triumph. It would be personal vindication. Victor convinces himself that if he can conquer death, then nothing that once hurt him can ever matter again. And yet, this belief is built on a dangerous illusion. Victor frames his work as progress, as enlightenment, as humanity's next great step forward. But beneath the rhetoric lies a quieter truth. He is not prepared for the responsibility that comes with creation. He seeks the power of a god without accepting the burden of one. Compassion, patience, and humility are absent from his calculations. He assumes that bringing life into the world is enough, that intention alone absolves consequence. This is the first and most critical error of his journey. As I reflect on this beginning, I realize that the true birth in this chapter is not the creature itself, but the obsession that gives rise to it. Long before flesh is stitched together, Victor has already crossed a line within himself. He chooses ambition over restraint, achievement over accountability, and in doing so, he sets into motion a tragedy that no amount of intellect can undo. This is not yet a story about monsters. It is a story about a man who believes greatness excuses everything, and who mistakes obsession for purpose. To understand Victor Frankenstein, I have to return to a place far removed from laboratories and lightning, back to the quiet cruelty of his childhood. On the surface, his life appears privileged. He is born the eldest son of Baron Leopold Frankenstein, surrounded by wealth, status, and opportunity. Yet beneath that polished exterior lies a household governed not by affection, but by fear. From an early age, Victor learns that love is conditional, earned only through obedience and excellence. Failure is not corrected with guidance, but punished with severity. This is the environment that shapes his understanding of authority, discipline, and worth. His father is a man of immense intellect and reputation, a respected physician whose presence fills every room even when he is absent. Leopold Frankenstein believes deeply in order, control, and legacy. He does not raise a child so much as he forges an heir. Victor is taught anatomy before empathy, precision before compassion. Knowledge is drilled into him relentlessly, reinforced by harsh discipline and impossible expectations. In this household, curiosity is allowed only when it aligns with ambition. Emotion is treated as weakness, vulnerability as something to be erased. I cannot help but see how this rigid upbringing plants the earliest seeds of Victor's later obsession with mastery and dominance. What makes this childhood even more isolating is the emotional absence that defines it. Leopold is rarely home, consumed by his work and his public image. When he does return, his presence brings tension rather than comfort. Arguments echo through the halls, power struggles disguised as family discussions. Victor grows up watching control replace affection, authority replace understanding. His mother, gentle yet restrained, offers moments of warmth, but even she exists under the shadow of her husband's will. For Victor, safety is temporary and approval fleeting. He learns early that survival depends on meeting expectations, not expressing needs. The turning point comes with loss. When his mother dies, giving birth to his younger brother, the fragile balance of the household collapses. Grief does not soften Leopold, it hardens him. Victor loses the one source of tenderness in his life and, with it, any sense of emotional grounding. His brother William, born into tragedy, receives a different version of their father, one shaped by guilt and belated affection. Victor watches this from a distance, internalizing a painful truth. Love is not given equally, and it can be withdrawn without warning. This realization breeds resentment, but also determination. If affection cannot be earned, then superiority must be. In this absence of love, a dangerous idea begins to take shape. Victor becomes obsessed with surpassing his father, not just intellectually, but existentially. Leopold commands respect through knowledge and authority, yet there is one force even he cannot control: death. To Victor, death becomes more than a natural end. It is a symbol of limitation, the final boundary that renders all power meaningless. And so, deep within his wounded psyche, a vow forms. He will conquer the one enemy his father could not. He will rise above fear, loss, and helplessness by mastering the very thing that took everything from him. Looking back, I realize that Victor's later actions cannot be separated from this upbringing. His inability to nurture, to empathize, to accept weakness, all trace back to a childhood ruled by fear rather than care. He does not seek to create life out of love for humanity, but out of a desire to erase vulnerability from his own story. In trying to defeat death, he is really trying to silence the frightened child he once was. And that child, shaped by fear and neglect, never truly learned what it means to love what one creates. This is the chapter where creation finally becomes reality, and where Victor Frankenstein's greatest failure begins to reveal itself. War provides the perfect cover for his work. Death is everywhere, and no one asks too many questions about bodies that never return home. Hidden inside an isolated tower, far from the judgment of society, Victor is given unlimited resources and complete freedom. I watch him immerse himself fully in his research, cutting himself off from the world as if isolation itself were proof of dedication. To Victor, this solitude feels earned. He believes history will remember him as a pioneer, not as a man who crossed a line he never fully understood. The process of creation is meticulous, deliberate, and chillingly clinical. Victor gathers remains from different sources, selecting each part with the precision of a craftsman chasing perfection. There is no hesitation in his hands, no visible doubt in his mind. His knowledge of anatomy is extraordinary, and his technical skill leaves little room for failure. Yet what unsettles me is not what he does, but what he ignores. Throughout this process, Victor never asks what kind of life he is preparing to bring into the world. He is focused entirely on success, on proving that death can be reversed. Purpose, responsibility, and consequence are treated as secondary concerns, postponed for later consideration. When the creature finally awakens, the moment is surprisingly quiet. There is no thunderous celebration, no triumphant declaration. Instead, there is confusion, fear, and fragile curiosity. The being before Victor is not a monster, not yet. It is empty in the way a newborn is empty, aware but unformed, dependent on guidance to understand the world. For a brief moment, Victor seems to recognize this. He teaches the creature how to stand, how to move, how to feel warmth from the sun. He even gives it his own name, as if claiming authorship over its existence. In those early days, I can almost believe that Victor feels something close to care, but that illusion does not last. As days turn into weeks, impatience replaces curiosity. The creature learns slowly, repeating the same sounds, clinging to Victor's presence for reassurance. What should have inspired patience instead provokes irritation. Victor grows frustrated, embarrassed by the creature's dependence, offended by its inability to meet his expectations. He begins to see the being not as a life he created, but as a problem he must endure. The warmth he once showed fades into cold efficiency, and then into outright hostility. This is where the film's emotional truth becomes undeniable to me. Victor does not fail as a scientist, he fails as a father. He expects immediate results without offering understanding. He demands growth without providing safety. His frustration mirrors the cruelty he once endured, passed down unconsciously like an inherited disease. Victor believes that intelligence alone is enough to shape life, but he has never learned how care works. He confuses authority with guidance, discipline with teaching, control with responsibility. The creature senses this rejection long before it can understand it. Confusion turns into fear, fear into silence. It retreats inward, responding not with violence, but with obedience and longing. Victor interprets this as weakness. He distances himself further, convinced that something has gone wrong with the experiment. What he never considers is that nothing has gone wrong at all. The creature is behaving exactly as a neglected child would. It is reacting not to failure, but to abandonment. As I watch this unravel, it becomes painfully clear that Victor's greatest mistake is not defying nature, but refusing to accept what creation truly demands. To bring life into the world is not an act of brilliance alone. It is a promise of care, patience, and responsibility that Victor is fundamentally unequipped to keep. In seeking to prove his superiority over death, he exposes his inability to nurture life, and in that failure, the tragedy of Frankenstein truly begins. If Victor Frankenstein represents the hunger to dominate life, then Elizabeth stands as its quiet counterbalance. Whenever she enters the story, the film seems to breathe differently. Through my eyes, she is not merely a supporting character, but the moral axis around which everything turns. Elizabeth approaches the world with curiosity rather than conquest. She studies nature not to bend it to her will, but to understand its fragile harmony. Where Victor sees potential for control, she sees responsibility. Where he seeks transcendence, she seeks meaning. Elizabeth's intelligence is never loud or performative. It reveals itself through patience, observation, and an ability to ask uncomfortable questions. She challenges Victor not with hostility, but with clarity. She reminds him that life is not defined solely by function or longevity, but by connection. Death, in her view, is not an enemy to be defeated at any cost, but a boundary that gives life its weight. Listening to her, I begin to understand how different her philosophy is from Victor's. He measures value through achievement. She measures it through care. This difference becomes most evident in the way she interacts with the creature. While Victor sees a failed experiment, Elizabeth sees a being searching for understanding. She does not recoil in fear or disgust. Instead, she observes, listens, and teaches. Her patience allows the creature to reveal qualities Victor never bothered to notice: gentleness, curiosity, and a deep desire to belong. Elizabeth treats the creature as someone worthy of dignity, not because it is perfect, but because it is alive. In doing so, she exposes the fundamental flaw in Victor's worldview. Creation without compassion is not progress. It is abandonment. Elizabeth's bond with the creature also reshapes my understanding of love in this story. Love, here, is not possession or desire. It is presence. It is the willingness to remain gentle, even when things are difficult. Victor mistakes control for care, believing that authority alone can shape life. Elizabeth proves the opposite. Through small gestures and consistent kindness, she becomes the first person to offer the creature something resembling safety. And in that safety, the creature begins to grow. This growth does not come from superior intellect or grand design, but from simple human attention. At the same time, Elizabeth's relationship with Victor reveals why she ultimately distances herself from him. She sees the anger beneath his brilliance, the resentment that fuels his ambition. When Victor speaks of love, it sounds more like ownership. When he imagines partnership, it is framed by control. Elizabeth understands that knowledge without empathy becomes dangerous. Her refusal is not an act of rejection, but of self-preservation. She refuses to repeat the pattern of submission she has seen destroy others. In that decision, she becomes a quiet act of resistance against the world Victor represents. What moves me most is how Elizabeth embodies the film's central question about life itself. She does not deny science or progress. She simply insists that they must be guided by humility. Life, to her, is not valuable because it can be extended indefinitely, but because it can be shared meaningfully. This belief stands in direct opposition to Victor's fear of death. Where he sees death as failure, she sees it as context. Without limits, life loses its urgency. Without compassion, creation loses its soul. Through Elizabeth, the film gently argues that the meaning of life is not found in mastery, but in care. She becomes a mirror that reflects Victor's shortcomings without cruelty. And in that reflection, I begin to see the tragedy more clearly. Victor had the intelligence to create life, but Elizabeth had the wisdom to understand it. In a story filled with ambition and destruction, she remains the quiet proof that gentleness, not power, is what truly sustains existence. As the story reaches its final movement, the question that once felt philosophical now becomes deeply personal. I find myself no longer asking what the creature has become, but what Victor Frankenstein has always been. By this point, the creature has endured rejection, fear, and abandonment at every turn. It has been driven from homes, chased by strangers, and denied even the most basic form of companionship. Yet, despite all of this, what defines the creature is not violence, but longing. It wants to belong. It wants to be seen. And most of all, it wants its creator to acknowledge it as more than a mistake. Victor, however, remains trapped in his own resentment. He looks at the being he brought into the world and sees only failure, reflection, and threat. He convinces himself that destroying the creature is an act of responsibility, that eliminating what he cannot control is the only rational choice. What troubles me is how easily Victor justifies this cruelty. He speaks the language of logic and caution, but beneath it lies fear. Fear of losing authority. Fear of facing his own errors. Fear of accepting that creation carries obligations he never intended to fulfill. The creature's request for a companion becomes the emotional center of this final chapter. It does not ask out of desire for power or domination, but out of loneliness. Immortality, which Victor once viewed as triumph, has become a curse. The creature understands itself as human in feeling, yet isolated by nature. Victor's refusal is framed as prudence, but I cannot ignore the deeper truth. By denying the creature companionship, Victor once again chooses control over compassion. He decides that it is better for life to remain alone than for love to exist beyond his authority. From this point onward, the creature's transformation feels inevitable, not because it is inherently monstrous, but because pain left unacknowledged always seeks an outlet. Trauma does not disappear simply because it is ignored. I am reminded again and again that the creature learns cruelty from the world that mistreats it. Each act of rejection becomes a lesson. Each moment of fear becomes a wound. By the time violence appears, it is not a surprise, but a consequence. The film never excuses this violence, but it refuses to divorce it from its cause. Victor, in contrast, never truly changes. He remains rigid, convinced of his moral superiority, blind to the parallels between his actions and those of his own father. The same impatience, the same harsh judgment, the same refusal to nurture what depends on him. In watching Victor condemn the creature, I see a man condemning the parts of himself he refuses to confront. He is horrified not by what the creature has done, but by what it reveals about him. One of the most haunting moments for me is the creature's final departure. It does not seek revenge. It does not demand forgiveness. Instead, it withdraws from humanity altogether, stepping into isolation as the only mercy left to it. Society will always fear what it does not understand, and so the creature chooses disappearance over destruction. In that decision, I find a quiet dignity that Victor never achieves. The being created from death chooses restraint. The man who defied death never learns it. By the end, the title's question answers itself. The monster is not defined by scars, silence, or unnatural origins. The real monster is the one who creates life without accepting responsibility for its suffering. It is the one who mistakes intelligence for wisdom and power for purpose. Frankenstein is not a warning about science alone. It is a warning about neglect, about pride, and about the damage caused when love is withheld. As I reflect on this story, I am left with a simple and unsettling truth. Creation demands care. Without it, even the most brilliant achievement becomes a tragedy. And perhaps the most frightening realization of all is that the monster was never something Victor built in his laboratory. It was something he carried within himself long before the experiment ever began.